Hello and welcome to the Uppsala Association of Foreign Affairs podcast. My name is Isidor Brommare, and a few weeks back we had the great pleasure of interviewing Jan Eliasson for the program. Jan Eliasson is one of Sweden's foremost diplomats, with many decades of service at the highest levels of the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the United Nations. During the interview we discuss his early career and his perspective on the current challenges facing the world. We hope you enjoy the program.
After Palme's death, I took over. I was asked by the UN to be the special representative over there. I have a piece of the Berlin Wall. Came the Crimea annexation, 2014. I was in Kiev when it happened. I was sent there by the Security Council. The first three words of this charter, is not we the governments. It's we the peoples. The world is waking up, but it's about time.
Hello and welcome to the Radio UF podcast of the Uppsala Association of Foreign Affairs. Today we have the great pleasure of welcoming Jan Eliasson, the former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and the former President of the United Nations General Assembly and the former Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for joining us, Jan Eliasson.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, and today we're going to discuss a wide array of subjects, but I think it would be interesting to start with your start in your career and what led you to pursue a career in international politics. So you grew up in Gothenburg, and as you during your early years, how did you find your way, or how did you discover an interest for international politics?
Well, first of all, tell me that I want to tell you that I have a background in Uppsala. And I was visiting professor there twice with Professor Peter Wallenstein, who was, of course, also the Dag Hammarskjöld professor. So I want to underline my link to Uppsala, this great university. I was there as recently as last Friday, the UN Day, 24th of October, and spoke to a large crowd of people, which shows that Uppsala is very internationally inclined. So thank you for keeping up that tradition by having your broadcast, your pod. Well, to begin with, my start was, of course, not at all directed in the international direction. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in Gothenburg. None of my parents or anyone in my family had been ever fully educated. But I got the support from teachers early on, and I entered one of the best schools in Gothenburg, Hvitfeldtska läroverket. And I had great teachers, and I was interested very much in languages. So I studied on the so-called Latin line of the school where I was studying, and studied English, French, German, Spanish, Latin, and that was mostly my inclination. I guess my interest in international affairs started with the immigration that started in my hometown after the war, Second World War. My father was a labor union leader, and he was a metal worker and was active in the labor unions. And he encouraged me to go and play football, soccer, as one says also, with the immigrant children who came with to SKF, the ball bearing factory in Gothenburg. And Sweden was in demand then as a country that had not been damaged by the war. And my father, I remember so strongly, said to me that you got to go down and welcome the Italian and Greek boys because they have no way to understand the language here. And they live in barracks, and they should feel pretty alone here. So you should go down with your group. So we went down and played soccer with them. That was my a reminder of the world outside Sweden. Sweden had been saved from the Second World War, but then came the immigration to Sweden, and that was a time when every immigrant was warmly welcomed, because they helped the economy of Gothenburg, Göteborg, my hometown, but also Sweden. And then came the 1956, the Suez invasion, but above all the Hungarian Revolution. And that was the beginning of a more dramatic view of the outside world. My father had told me about the Korean War. I was a young teenager, and I didn't quite understand what was going on. But when the Hungarian refugees came in 1956, after the Soviet violence against the revolution, then my political interest in the world started rather drastically. And I very much wanted to work with international issues already at the age 16, 17. And when I saw a chance then to study abroad, which was a unique program at the time, American Field Service, which brought me to a state in the US, right in the Midwest, middle of America, Indiana, soybean capital of the world, Decatur, 10,000 people. I was the first foreigner to come to that high school. A very special, exotic creature I was. And that was, of course, a tremendous experience. I had great teachers there also. One was the teacher of so-called public speaking and speech. So that's where I actually learned had my first experience in giving public speeches. And then I wanted to have fresh air and see the world. So when I had graduated Studenten, the baccalaureate, I went to the Navy. So I became a Navy officer. I was a Navy officer for 3 years altogether. I was out on a destroyer, traveling around the Mediterranean, and really had an experience of seeing the outside world in a very hands-on way, and I loved that very much. And I'm still a lieutenant commander of the Navy, which is pretty good when I meet military dictators all over the world, that they know that I'm a Navy officer. So I have some credibility, not only as hopefully a diplomat, but also as a Navy officer. And then I was admitted to the Foreign Ministry after 3 years of studying economy in the School of Economics in Gothenburg. And there I was international secretary because I had such an interest in international issues. And we brought in foreign students and we went abroad. I went to work, by the way, in France. I worked for a steel industry in France. And that was good for my French, of course, but also as an experience living in Paris is not bad. So, and then I came into the Foreign Service, and, well, the story then you know pretty well. 23 years abroad has been my diplomatic life. And not to give too polished a picture of what it was like, I can tell you that out of these 23 years, 7 years were out without my family. Because I was out in mediation efforts in Iran-Iraq and Darfur and Nagorno-Karabakh, all over the place, and situations where I didn't want to bring my family, and they weren't interested in going either. So that's, all in all, a summary of what brought me to the world of diplomacy.
Thank you very much. And during your early career, there was the Cold War. And how was your experience working as a Swedish diplomat during the Cold War? Because Sweden had in Europe at least, a pretty unique stance of a formal neutral foreign policy. How were you perceived, do you think, in relation to your other international colleagues?
Well, we had a growing international role from the mid-60s onwards. A very important personality for the direction which we went was, of course, Olof Palme, who later became Prime Minister. But already before that, he was an advisor to the former Prime Minister, Tage Erlander. And he brought in the element of passion, more or less, on the resistance to the American war and the American and Vietnamese war. So the Vietnam issue became an enormously huge issue. It was demonstrations all over and engaged of students and people even out in the streets, demonstrations. So it was a wake-up call on the world outside for us. So when I entered the Foreign Service, I felt that nerve, already. And the interesting thing was, as you said, the environment was characterized by Cold War, but that left a room of maneuver for a country like Sweden. As a neutral, non-aligned, if some people say, country, which did not belong to NATO or the Warsaw Pact. There was no doubt whatsoever that we were and are a democracy in the Western character. But we had a position that we were often asked to be a middleman, a mediator, a country that produced solutions for environment and for development, sustainable development later on. Were also asked to go into peacekeeping operations. So altogether, from that period onwards, about 80,000 Swedes have served in UN peacekeeping. And the beginning was very much characterized by other countries wanting to have neutral countries in, so they didn't get caught up in the Cold War entanglements. So that left Sweden in a pretty good position. And with Palme taking over as prime minister, this role increased very much. We got involved in mediation, several situations in the Middle East and elsewhere. Building on traditions from the past, by the way. We had Count Bernadotte, who was mediating in the Middle East. We had Hjalmar Branting, a former prime minister, back in the League of Nations. So it was a tradition, but dormant. But it more or less exploded in the late 60s, early 70s, and under Palme's leadership. And then, of course, he himself was asked to mediate in the Iran-Iraq War, 1980, by the UN. And he asked me then, which was a sort of decisive moment in my life. I was just a regular diplomat, having served in Paris, Bonn, and Washington, but he picked me as his advisor, as his assistant in the mediation, 1980. And I then served with him doing that, shuttle diplomacy between Baghdad and Tehran. And then he asked me to be his diplomatic advisor when he became prime minister in 1982. And then I left the UN, the Foreign Ministry service for some time, but I returned rather quickly to the ministry with his blessing. But he kept the position as mediator, and I was serving with him for about 6 years. So that was the position, and Sweden became a strong nation together with the other Nordics, in particular the UN. We were not members of the European Union at the time, but so the UN became our primary arena. And this we were both in mediation and in development and in human rights, where I later became very active. So I would say that we were favored very much by having that neutral position. And we were probably playing above our weight, as they say in boxing. At that time.
Mm. And you mentioned your work with Olof Palme in Iran and Iraq, and that was a pretty long conflict and a particularly violent conflict as well. What was your experience mediating in the conflict, and how was the process, and what strategies did you and Palme employ to try to get the parties to the table?
Well, it was a very complicated process, and looking back at it, I still regret very much that the parties didn't listen to us from the beginning. We had a primary approach that was sort of combining different factors and wanted to have a a solution which was lasting at an early stage. Maybe that was too ambitious, but the irony is that what we proposed 1 year after the conflict was later the result of the negotiations 7 years later. And the difference is 700,000 people dead. So my experience is that starting war and continuing war is a pretty desperate and futile effort. I have become extremely critical of those who choose military solutions. I hope you saw the quotation marks. I don't consider it solutions. Iran and Iraq are still paying a price for that. But what happened when we couldn't get this comprehensive solution, this broader package solution that we wanted from the beginning, we then tried to have a step-by-step approach. So we banned certain attacks across the border by artillery to civilian targets. We tried to open up for shipping in the Shatt al-Arab and the Gulf area so that trade wasn't affected that much. We tried in many ways sort of to reduce the level of fighting and the level of violence, which with various results, but still we made some progress. In the end, after Palme's death, I took over. I was asked by the UN to be the special representative. I was then Sweden's ambassador to the United Nations. So it was handy because I served in New York at that time. So 1988, we succeeded to get a ceasefire in August 88. And I took over those negotiations in the end of August. That was enormously complicated, difficult. And both sides felt a deep hatred against each other. The Iranians, the Iraqis, because they felt the Iranians had brought the revolution, tried to bring the revolution from the Shia world to the Sunni world. And the Iranians were extremely upset, of course, because of the use of chemical weapons that had been employed by Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq. So the parties didn't want to see each other, more or less, but we still had to bring them together, and we brought them together for the first time ever in the same room in early September 1988. And I was in on that meeting. It was quite a feeling to see them meet for the first time. And then we had intense negotiations, trying to keep them at the table, because both sides actually wanted, in certain circles, to start the war again. So we had to keep them back. And that required to be, for me as chair of the negotiations, to be innovative and give them questions and homework so they wouldn't leave. I had contact with the airport of Geneva to make sure that they didn't order their planes to go. Because if that had happened, then I would have had to use tougher methods to keep them. But they kept going, and the war did not break out again. But both sides paid a huge price for that war. But I feel that I was convinced by many things during those negotiations. But one is to try to be using preventive methods. The best thing would be to avoid war at all. The second one is to finish the war as quickly as possible. Because once you let that genie out of the bottle in wars, it's extremely difficult to bring it back. Just look at Ukraine, where Putin thought he would have the over within a week, and now we are on our fourth year. Look at Gaza, where Netanyahu thought he would have the operation done very quickly, and Hamas would be completely defeated. Now we are into that for such a long time with this horrible, horrible toll of human beings being killed and starved. So there are many lessons from that, but that became later my specialty, more or less. I mediated altogether in 6 different conflicts, mostly war, but also humanitarian crisis, where people's life were at stake, and we had to get in to people in need. And that became, for some time, even a Swedish specialty. I have colleagues, younger colleagues who were with me, who are now doing the work. But less and less, unfortunately. The remaining one now is Hans Grundberg, who is the special mediator in the Yemen conflict. But Sweden was, together with Norway, as I would say, maybe the most attractive partner to bring into conflicts, to mediate. And then we also completed that with development assistance and humanitarian assistance. And later on, more and more, human rights. And international law, respect of international law, which is crucial.
And many of your mediating assignments were at the direction of the United Nations.
Most of them, all of them actually, except the Nagorno-Karabakh,
Okay.
the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I was asked by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, but mostly UN, and it is the UN that I should play that role. If the Security Council allows it to happen, I am openly disappointed and frustrated about the Security Council not doing what they are supposed to do. They have a responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and they don't do it. And they have misused the veto to a great degree, either using it right on, and as happened during the Cold War, but also the threat of the veto to stop negotiations. I am a true diplomat, I would say. I love my profession, and I think negotiation is an art form that should continue until you have reached the very end, if ever you do that. I don't even accept reaching the end, and I consider starting a war a tremendous failure. And using the veto is even also a failure. And I tell the permanent members of the Security Council when I could, as President of the General Assembly and Deputy Secretary General as I served. But they don't seem to listen and understand that when they let these forces out of war and conflict, then they are also on the losing end. Everybody loses. I have hardly seen any really winner. I mean, of course, the Second World War, Hitler, that was a win, no doubt. But otherwise, nations come out poor and wretched and full of hatred and disappointment and poverty and lots of feelings that remain in the country. I would say that even now, today, 2025, Iran and Iraq still pay a price for this 8-year-long war, with the damage it did to society and to religious coexistence and so forth.
And the United Nations this year celebrated 80 years as an organization. And since its founding, what would you say has been the effect of the United Nations on the international system? What role has it played in promoting peace and...
Well, on the most general level, I would say that when the authors of the UN Charter met, or the incoming authors of the Charter met in San Francisco in 1945, they devised a system and formulated rules for international cooperation and behavior, which constitute what I would say a system for the world as it should be. That is actually the most important contribution of the UN. This charter, this beautiful charter, is probably one of the best documents that formulates the frustration and the sadness and the experiences of the horrors that occurred between 1930 and 1945, with communism in its Stalinistic form, with fascism in Germany, Italy, Japan, with the Second World War, with the horrible Holocaust. This darkest period, I would say, in modern times, was sort of mirrored in a good way by what we wanted to do after this period of horror. So the UN, I always say that to my colleagues when the UN is powerless in certain situations, as we are often now. I say, remember, we should know the world as it is. And it's not a pretty place. We must be knowledgeable about that. But we must never forget the world as it should be. And this is what the UN is. I wanted to develop that because if we have a society, a world, where you only deal with the conflicts and the horrors and the poverty and the violations of human rights and international law, then we become bitter and cynical. We always have to have something to aim for. And that's what the UN is for, to remind us of what the world should be. Having said that, there are lots of practical things the UN has done. I think the UN has been absolutely crucial for decolonization. The African countries' independence partly is of the processes that UN encouraged. So that's a very major historic view. And also the international programs of assistance and humanitarian assistance, the principle of solidarity, of helping each other in a global manner, is also sort of represented in the UN. And then, of course, the work that was done in mediation, if I may say so, where I myself was mostly active, but also peacekeeping, keeping the peace. And more, I would hope, but although I don't think we have done enough, on prevention and peacemaking and peace building. That's where we still have work to do. The question now is that UN, unfortunately, finds itself in a rather troubled place and troubled position because the major powers, particularly the US and Russia, have departed from international law in a serious manner. Russia's military aggression against Ukraine, it was a breach of international law and, of course, the UN Charter, Article 2.4 and other articles. And the US policies with their ambition on creating spheres of interest, whether it is Greenland or Panama or Canada, I don't know, are also in violation of the equality of nations and international law. So with that situation, I would say countries like Sweden, even if we have entered NATO, which I in the end favored after careful analysis, but even as a NATO member, we should be standing up for respect of international law, and we should stand up for development assistance, we should stand up for mediation, we should stand up for global responsibility. And that is not prevented by a NATO membership. I think Norway has proved that a NATO member can stand up for these values and these objectives, and we should do so. And since you mentioned earlier, and I also mentioned myself, Olof Palme, I recall that he told me when I was his diplomatic advisor, in preparation of a speech that he was going to give in the UN in the early 80s, he asked me to have a first line in the speech saying that respect for international law is our first line of defense. Our first line of defense. In particular, this is valued for small and medium-sized nations who are living in a world where the major powers are developing spheres of interest and not accepting the global solidarity and the global rules. I think that was tremendous historic foresight. I could use the same term even more relevant today.
And working in the United Nations, you've held many different positions. And during your time, what was a particular achievement that you and your colleagues achieved that you look back on and value highly?
Well, I was part of the group of people who developed the ceasefire agreement between Iran and Iraq. And I also negotiated what was going to be a peace agreement, which didn't occur, but at least the war did not break out again between Iran and Iraq. an achievement in the area was the Kuwait action by the UN after the invasion of Iraq, and by mostly Saddam Hussein at his behest. And the UN was, of course, behind that very strong, effective reaction, violent to a great degree, regretfully, but necessary also at the time. I was I was working very hard after I had my mediation experiences on humanitarian affairs. I was responsible for the disaster activities, disaster reduction activities in the UN, emergency relief coordinator for 2 years in the 90s. And there I'm particularly proud of one event or phenomenon. You may have read my book, Ord och Handling, Word and Action, and that was in Sudan, 1993, when I was sent out to bring in assistance to an area that was isolated by war, the war between south and north of Sudan at the time, but also by landmines that were spread around this area, and 60,000 people were in danger of losing their lives out of starvation and isolation of war. So I went there to get a local ceasefire, but failed miserably in the couple of first days to discuss this. They were not at all interested in the Khartoum government to have a ceasefire. So in the end, I changed the word. This proves the value and the importance of the word. I departed from a negotiation on the ceasefire, local ceasefire, which was impossible because they considered the South terrorists. And that would give them legitimacy if I had achieved a ceasefire. And by the way, I don't think I could have got observers within a brief period because the serious situation was so critical. So I changed the mediation to a humanitarian corridor. A humanitarian corridor was accepted by both sides. And we could fly in food and medicine and so forth to this area. And it was the word that saved lives, maybe thousands of lives. So of that I'm very proud. But I just think I'm proud that I have been working in an organization that stands for what the world should be. And that I remind with that, as I did last week of all the speeches I gave on the UN. I reminded that when people are getting depressed about the situation of the world, we need to bring out energy from ideas and from the sense of solidarity with people in need, and that international good international solutions, are also in the national interest. We should, if we could come to a stage where people and nations understand that, for instance, the climate agreement that I helped also bring about 2015, and the Sustainable Development Goals, by the way, same year, they are not only a good international solution to sustainable development, but they're also in the national interest. If we could understand that the UN is not something out there, idealistic organization, it's actually working for peace, development, and human rights, which are the basic pillars for decent societies and peaceful societies. And that is in the national interest. But we haven't reached that yet.
And you started working in the United Nations at the late stages of the Cold War, and you write about it in your book as well, that the end of the Cold War brought about a new situation in the international system where a lot of changes could be observed, positive changes on international cooperation. How did you observe that the end of the Cold War impacted the functioning of the United Nations?
Oh, it was wonderful. I was UN ambassador in 1989 when the wall tumbled down in Europe. The famous pictures of the wall falling down. Over there, I have a piece of the Berlin Wall. Can you see it? Take the colorful behind you. There.
This one?
Yeah, lift it up.
Oh, wow.
That's a piece of the Berlin Wall that fell. I got it from a German friend. Let me show you. they had written graffiti on it.
Oh yeah.
And then they took out pieces, and I received one from a friend of mine. I have it in a prominent place here at my home. So in the UN, it was quite a wonderful period. NATO countries worked together with former communist countries, and the non-aligned movement was in line with the Nordic countries fully, and so forth. It was one of the best periods. That's when we created the humanitarian mandate for the UN, 1991. And the veto was hardly ever used those years. It was the negotiations in the Security Council going on. But then the situation deteriorated. The system of democracy that I think Gorbachev particularly aimed for did not come about in Russia. The oligarchs took over the economic and financial role during Yeltsin's period. And when Putin came in, he was welcomed, and he was also favorable in the beginning to the West, but the relationship soured seriously. The Russians reacted against NATO enlargement and the German reunification also at a later stage. And then, of course, Russia acted in a very aggressive manner, both in Georgia and in Ukraine. And, well, now we see where we are, in a very serious situation for security in Europe and in the world, and where, unfortunately, the UN is pretty powerless because of this tension between permanent members of the Security Council.
And you, as Deputy Secretary General, now we have the many conflicts, global conflicts, a rise in global conflict. Did you start to observe these deteriorations? At what stage did you realize that it might be going in the wrong direction?
Well, I think it's successively started around 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. Before that period, in the end of the 90s and early 2000, I talked with Russian foreign ministers about Russia being part of the European Union, even jokingly part of NATO, that we would have a joint new security structure. That was seriously discussed, at least in an informal manner, but then relations soured. Putin gave a very aggressive speech in the Munich Security Conference 2007, and then came Georgia and the military action there, where also, by the way, the Georgian leader, Saakashvili, I think made huge mistakes. But the Russians, of course, committed aggression and took over part of Georgia, as they have. And then came the Crimea annexation, 2014. I was in Kiev when it happened. I was sent there by the Security Council. I tried to develop a stronger UN presence in Crimea, but my people were chased away, actually. It's not known too much, but I can tell you, I tried to send a mission out to Crimea while the Russians were more or less taking over Crimea. And then the international reaction was probably too weak after that breach of international law, because many people felt that there was sort of a historic link back to Russia, and they got away with it. And then came the fighting by the Ukrainians in that area, which wasn't well noted, actually, for many years, between 1914 and 1922, when the full invasion came. And, well, that story is well known.
Mm. And the Ukraine war, when it's in 2014, of course, but also in 2022, it is often described as a somewhat of a turning point or an unprecedented event in modern history and in Europe. How would you characterize the full-scale invasion that we saw in 2022, and since then as the largest land war in Europe since the Second World War?
No, it's a historic tragedy and a horrible mistake by Russia to do this. They have let out the genie of the bottle, as I said earlier, and it's so difficult to bring it back. Military logic and prestige and vanity and lust for power and worries about regime effects of not winning the war, quotation mark, although I rather rarely see winners in wars. No, you can't exaggerate the tragedy and the size of that mistake. And what is also making me rather frustrated is, of course, that I see very few avenues leading to a political or a diplomatic solution. We are caught in a bind by blatant military aggression being committed, and where already 20% of Ukraine's territory is under control by the invading power, and where Ukraine rightly feels that military conquest is not legally acceptable, which is correct. So what do? Get a ceasefire without conditions, but where, of course, the end game still must be to restore the international borders, but which is something which the present leadership of Russia definitely do not accept. So we are in a situation where, unfortunately, I see continued war as a great risk and possibility, and I must undermine risk because there's been an escalation going on, and the escalation continues. And what is at stake is, of course, European security for all of us. And that's why countries like Sweden and smaller countries, medium-sized countries, are so involved, particularly those who are in the neighborhood of Russia and have historic experiences of Russian action. So it's a very, very difficult situation. So to add to this, of course, that we have the most horrific war going on, or not even war, violence going on in the Middle East. What has been going on in Gaza is unbelievable. I'd never thought we would have this extent of violence that is going on after the, of course, horrible, brutal action of Hamas in October 2 years ago. But still, what Israel is doing in terms of reaction goes beyond international law, and is, to me, a clear breach of international law, clearly war crimes and crimes against humanity. And to see that happen in today's age, coming from a country that calls itself democratic, is a tragedy. And I also want to blame the US, who could have been tougher on keeping that response within proportions. But neither the Biden administration nor Trump have been doing that. I hope the latest effort by Trump to achieve peace will be a step in the right direction, but I have my doubts, and already now there is violence of a rather extensive nature going on, not only in Gaza, but growingly also on the West Bank. And if that explodes, we have another chapter of violence and another chapter of lack of cohesion in the Western democracy's response.
And what do you think these two conflicts, of course, are very widely discussed, and there's also now the ongoing war in Sudan as well. What do you think that these conflicts have had, the impact that these conflicts and the continuation of the conflicts have had on the international rules-based order, the confidence in it?
Well, we have hardly ever, as I recall it, had such strain on the international orders. The system, or the strains on international law are serious. The strains on human rights are serious. The reduction of development assistance is obvious. US has cut it drastically. Even Sweden, my own country, has cut it down. And the UN is in a rather powerless situation. Since the major powers are in conflict, then the veto will come out there, and people not even trying to get good resolutions. They're not even trying to get a negotiation. Logically, I could understand why in Ukraine and Middle East it's difficult to get a UN Security Council decision, a binding decision. I can understand that, regretfully. But I can't understand why the UN Security Council has allowed the Sudan war to go on in this for this long time, and in this horrible nature. We have a group of military who have revolted against the government, a group of military that I know myself from my time as mediator. It was the origin of the RSF in Sudan is the Janjaweed militia, which went through the villages in Darfur where I was active as a mediator. And they came on camels and horses and threw dead dogs and dead sheep in the wells so that the water sources were poisoned and people had to flee. That's what they did. And these are the guys who now are supported by some Gulf countries because they were in gratitude for what they did and helped them with the Houthi war against the Houthis in Yemen. It's a cynicism that, to me, is incredible. Fortunately, now it seems like the world is waking up, but it's about time.
And looking at the current mediating efforts, primarily by the Trump administration in Gaza and in Ukraine, how would you... in Gaza, there was a ceasefire reached, and there's, of course, been a recent breach in the ceasefire. But how would you assess the attempts by the Trump administration with your experience?
Well, I think it was good that they brought about a reduction of the violence. It is not a well-working ceasefire. The military activities are going on still. There were over 100 people killed 2 days ago only, out of which 40 children. It's incredible happening during a so-called ceasefire. So, and also I think there finally, the last few days, there's been an improvement of the humanitarian assistance. The lorries are going in there in growing numbers, but it was very late. It is very late. But what I fear is that Israel will not want to enter the political and diplomatic phase of discussing the political future of the Palestinians and Gaza and West Bank. There are groups inside the present government which do not accept their right to a state as given in the UN Security Council resolutions and as planned ever since 1947, the two-state solution. It is considered absolutely unrealistic by a great majority of people, not a great majority, but still, unfortunately, by a majority of people in Israel. And Netanyahu is building on that. So how can you have a ceasefire where you don't have a continuation into a political process? And where in the end, and what status in the end will the Palestinians have? If you have a future where they will be forced out, you have a historic tragedy to be compared to the Nakba, the disaster of 1947-48. But if they get a chance to stay, they cannot be an occupied part of the area. It's against international law, and it's against human dignity to be occupied. So this is an unsolved equation which requires not only international action, coordinated international action, but also a new way of thinking inside Israel. And I'm a great friend of Israel. I've been working for Israel in so many situations of the past. I'm sad and I'm frustrated to see that they are not seeing that long-term perspective. And to see that coming from people who have suffered so enormously in the past is almost impossible to grasp. So I must say the situation generally to me in the world is very disturbing. I have always been an optimist, but now I am more often a worried optimist, sometimes turning into a pessimist who has not given up yet, because my belief is that we must never give up. Alva Myrdal, who is one of my heroes, a Swedish politician of the 30s and 40s and 50s, 60s also, by the way, she always said, when people criticized her for being unrealistic in her disarmament ambitions, she said, it is not dignified to give up. Det är inte värdigt att ge upp in Swedish. Det är inte värdigt att ge upp. So she has been a reminder to me when I'm standing in front of these big hills, uphill battles, to never give up, but mobilize the good forces. And there are many good forces. When I go around the schools in Stockholm and outside and feel the desire of young people to create a better world, and when I meet young women in women's organizations, and when I go to university, I feel encouraged. There's still hope. We must never give up.
And wrapping up our conversation, what would you say? You mentioned the passion of young people. What would you say is something that gives you hope for the future in this?
Well, in the present political situation in Europe, with Russia and involved in Ukraine in such a horrible way, I believe that the good news is that it is a wake-up call for Europe to develop its own capacity, both in terms of security, to face possible situations of that nature in the future, but also for democracy. Europe should be a global voice for democracy, especially now when the US is, in my view, going in a direction which is pretty doubtful that it is the form of democracy that I want to see. So Europe has a tremendous responsibility for both security and for democracy, and that is a challenge that we should accept, and particularly the Nordic countries. Now when the 5 Nordic countries have one solution for its basic security, namely based on NATO solidarity, then we are all members of NATO, and that we should then, with our background in mediation and assistance and international law respect and so forth, we should play that role also inside NATO. So that gives me hope in the sort of the short-term political environment now. In the long term, I draw hope from young people. I draw hope from women who have not yet had their full emancipation in the world. That's the best news we can have, when they have their full emancipation. And I draw hope from knowledge, that you young people continue your studies and put Sweden high up on the knowledge barometers. And then I have hope, of course, in international cooperation. I believe, as I said, that good international solutions are a national interest. And that's why we should never stop pursuing them. And UN is our best tool. There are those who want to play it down and they openly show contempt in front of it. Yes, you may try to do that, but my God, you can't kill ideas. You can't suffocate these tremendously important basics for decent human behavior and decent behavior among nations. And I always remind people that the first 3 words of this charter, is not we the governments, it's we the peoples. This was organized to make life decent unbearable indeed for many, on the individual level. And the formula that I devised together with Kofi Annan in 2005, when I was President of the General Assembly, still stands to me as the direction to go. We wrote in the preamble to the final document, 2005, presented to the General Assembly, under Sweden's chairmanship. There is no peace without development. But there is no development without peace. And there is no peace and no development without respect of human rights. So you have three pillars who have to be equally strong. Peace, development, sustainable such, and human rights, and respect for international law. When you have all these three developments going in the right direction, then we are on the way to create a much better world. And we aren't on our way right now, but we have to get back on that path.
And with those very insightful remarks, I want to thank you, John, for taking the time to join us here. And thank you also for the historic support that you've shown for the Uppsala Association of Foreign Affairs and Uppsala.
It will continue.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
As a
Good luck.
Of our appreciation also, we have a gift here from the association to you. So
thank you very much.
Some caramels there from
thank you.
Pärlans, Stockholm.
This will be a great contribution to to my wife,
yes.
who will soon come back from her tennis. She will be say to me, "How nice guests you must have had."
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.